All right, why don't we go ahead and get started, Ethan?
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. I'm Ethan Lockwood, project manager with the Water Trust, here to do our little virtual site visit. For today, I'm going to go ahead and just run through our relatively short presentation, and then leave plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. So we'll go ahead and start here. Just sort of as a reminder, the Water Trust put in a programmatic purchase program application with the goal of acquiring senior Teanaway River water rights. And that pre-application that we put in had 7 different landowners identified, and that totaled up to about 3.9 CFS of diverted water. And currently we have 1 signed purchase and sale agreement, and that single purchase and sale agreement is for 4 water rights for 81.78 acres of irrigated land and 1.64 CFS diverted. And that single project represents about 42% of our targeted diverted water rights. And sort of looking at that map, that upper left corner, that's section 5, section 31 water rights, which are our highest priority. Of those water rights, this project represents 55% of the water that we have been identifying and seeking acquisition for. 2 other quick reminders. One is that the Water Trust has significant cost share for acquisitions, usually around 50% through the National Fish and Wildlife's Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program. And then the acquired in-stream flow is placed in the Washington Trust Water Rights Program. There's monitoring of compliance by the Water Trust, additional monitoring by Department of Fish and Wildlife, and enforcement when necessary of those in-stream flows by the local ecology water master. So specifically, what is the sort of transaction that we're seeking funding for? This is with the Cromartie family. And so I just kind of want to walk through the water rights that we're talking about, their location, and a little bit of the context for them here. So if you look at that locator map, you can see that that main red line is the road up on the Teanaway. So you come in on the Teanaway and we're up at the Forks. You can see the river that's running through the middle of the screen. That's the North Fork Teanaway River. And then you can see the forks there that split into the Middle Fork and West Fork. And the orange parcels that are highlighted on this map are all of the parcels that the Cromartie family owns. And then the dashed black lines show where the water rights are pertinent to. So you can see down in the bottom right, they have water rights pertinent in section 5. And then you can see in the middle of the screen, they have water rights in section 31. And so those section 31 water rights have a priority date of 1902. It's a 1.22 CFS diversion and 244 acre feet between those 2 water rights. And the diversion points are located upstream in section 29. So if you look at that top right corner of the map, you see those 3 triangles. And so that's the diversion points for those water rights. The 1902 water right does face curtailment roughly 1 in 10 years. So it's an interruptible water right. And section 31 in the Teanaway is a red zone for mitigation currently. So there's no mitigation water available in section 31 at this time. And if we look down then at section 5, the section 5 water rights, you can see that they have overlapping places of use. The 2 water rights there have a priority date of 1886 and 1887. They represent 0.51 CFS diverted and 103 acre feet annually. And the diversion points for those water rights, there's 2 of them. Those are those purple triangles. So there's one in section 6 on the North Fork Teanaway. That's the main diversion point. There's an additional diversion point on Story Creek in section 5, historically for supplementing that water right. And in 2015, during the sort of most severe drought, we saw curtailment all the way down to these 1886-87 rights. In section 5 and in section 32, there is currently mitigation water available through the Bourne Water Bank. So that's just sort of the relative location and seniority of the water rights that we're looking at acquiring. And so sort of taking a little bit of a step back, I want to sort of give some context for how the Washington Water Trust has approached acquiring in-stream flow in the Teanaway. This kind of transaction development really parallels pretty strongly that whole approach. And so if we think all the way back to the early 2000s, when the Water Trust first started looking at acquiring water rights and improving in-stream flow, it really was short-term leases and forbearance agreements. Prior to 2001, the Cromartie family was actively irrigating. That picture to the right is not actually their diversion, but a very similar diversion in the Teanaway, where they were using push-up berm dams on the North Fork Teanaway to get their water out to their fields. And so since 2001, when the Cromarties first leased their water, in that case it was with the Rosa Irrigation District, there's been no irrigation under these water rights during that period. And so the Water Trust negotiated 2 short-term leases from 2003 to 2005, and then again from 06 to 09. And then the Water Trust had quite a number of these short-term leases and forbearance agreements with a number of different water right holders in the Teanaway. And there's a large transaction cost associated with continuing the negotiation and the paperwork and agency approval for that type of agreement. So around 2009, the Water Trust transitioned from sort of a short-term lease and forbearance approach to trying to convert short-term to long-term agreements. And in particular with the Cromartie family, we then had an agreement from 2009 to 2014 to lease their water rights. During that same time period, it's important to note, right, in 2009, 2010, the Kittitas Emergency Ground Rule went into effect, and there was the need for a new approach for acquiring water in the Teanaway. The value of water really increased with mitigation water now being an option for some people. And the Water Trust and many others had concerns around what would this mean for irrigation, for development, for the water rights. And the approach that the Water Trust developed was to really look at working with the water right holders to find the win-win for the stream and for them. And so the highest and best use for some of these senior water for the water right holders was to take a very small amount of that water, a small CFS and acre feet amount of their total water right, and use that for mitigation where the value of the water is the highest, but that the vast majority of that water right not needed for the mitigation and not available for mitigation could be protected in stream. And so that's sort of the approach that we've been working with for senior water rights. And at the same time, the Water Trust moved from long-term agreements to pursuing permanent agreements with the goal of permanently protecting the in-stream flows in the Teanaway, such that at some point in the future, if we could acquire sufficient flows in a permanent agreement protection status, those flows would be permanently acquired and that we wouldn't have incurring continual cost associated with those agreements. The Cromartie family has had their water rights donated in trust from 2015 to 2020. During that whole period, pretty much from 2009 until today, the Water Trust has been negotiating with the family around a permanent acquisition. And now in 2021, the family has signed a purchase and sale agreement for acquisition of the rights. And so we want to really just sort of put out on the table exactly what this transaction structure looks like. The Cromartie family, to get them at the table and to make them interested in this transaction, they are seeking limited mitigation, approximately about 10 units or 1 acre foot in the current red zone for existing parcels under an interruptible water right in exchange for the permanent commitment to in-stream flow. And so it's very clear to all parties that that is a big ask from the Cromartie family. And there needs to be clear environmental benefit that balances out that limited mitigation request. And so what has the Water Trust negotiated so far with the Cromartie family? And I see Rebecca, we'll sort of dive into more of the details here on what that means, and there'll be time to answer questions. And to be clear, I see that other question. None of the water that we're asking Surfboard to fund would be for mitigation. So there's 10 acre-feet of water in the purchase and sale agreement that's carved out for mitigation at this time. The acquisition through Surfboard is only for the in-stream flow portion. So looking at what are the conditions we've talked to with the family, we've been very clear the mitigation would be only for existing parcels that the Cromartie family owns. It would be for indoor domestic mitigation only. There would be no retained irrigation water in any form. And any retained water not needed for the mitigation would be required to be folded back in and protected in stream. And this does not involve any new water bank. This would be a mitigation exchange with the Cromartie family and an existing water bank. And I'll get into some more details and can answer questions about that. And so sort of seeing, right, this is my little model here on a balance. What balances this out on the environmental benefits? We have at least 95%, quite likely more of the water rights in terms of the acre feet and CFS permanently protected in stream. That's a primary reach benefit of about 1.6 CFS and a secondary reach benefit of about 0.9 CFS. This would represent a permanent commitment of the furthest upstream North Fork Teanaway irrigation water rights through the fallowing of 82 acres. So a pretty big, significant acquisition. And a trust water right agreement with any water bank that the Cromartie family worked with would be require approval by ecology with extra conditions, sort of working with Yakima Nation, Kittitas County, and Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop sort of what conditions might be placed around that. And so quickly on the environmental benefit side, just sort of thinking about what does this represent in the Teanaway River. This graph here shows that down on the x-axis, you see the river miles. That's river mile 12 all the way to river mile 0. And then the graph shows the amount of protected water acquired through the Washington Water Trust. And so you can see that dark blue is permanent acquisition water. So that's water that is permanently in stream at this time. That sort of brownish color shows the temporary. So that's water that's currently on long-term leases. And then the yellow shows the proposed permanent Cromartie acquisition, how that would stack upon both that permanent and temporary. And you can see, I kind of called that down at river mile 0.5, right? That's that critical referral that we're really looking to secure that 12 CFS of flow. And this would be a significant contribution, as you can see, to reaching that target. And so on the mitigation water, what are we talking about? What's in the purchase and sale agreement? So as I said, the purchase and sale agreement set 10 acre feet of non-additive mitigation water. So non-additive meaning that there's 10 acre feet of the 1902 water and 10 acre feet of the 1887-86. That water does not combine to 20 acre feet. That's just 10 acre feet that's been set aside at this time. Now, the details of what happens with that mitigation water, we're very much in the scoping phase with that. We're very interested in hearing from you guys and from others. So some of those open questions at this time is how many total mitigation certificates may be allowed in section 5 and 32. So as a reminder, section 5 and 32 are currently in the green zone of the Bourne Water Bank. Section 31, which would be the extension into the current red zone. Just to get a little bit of context of what's the potential amount, if we look at the non-Cromartie parcels in section 31, there's 10 of those currently. and there's 11 Cromartie parcels. So that's about 21 parcels at this time in section 31. Other questions that still are in the scoping phase is who the Cromarties would partner with in terms of what water bank they would be looking to exchange with. So that's still open, could be with the Bourne Water Bank or could be with the county. Other open questions, things like which seniority of the water rights will be used to back the Section 31 mitigation under the backing of the existing water banks. That's still an open discussion of the approach of either using the 1902, which is a more interruptible water right, or considering using the 1886 and 87, which would require an upstream transfer to cover the Section 31. Other open questions at this time are other conditions that might be attached to the mitigation certificates in Section 31. These could include things like no development in both the floodway and floodplain possibly, and other environmental considerations that might be desired by the groups that we talk with. And sort of where are we at in these discussions? They're pretty initial at this time. We've got meetings and are discussing sort of the scope and scale of mitigation and who would be suitable. We're talking with Kelsey Collins at Ecology, Arden Thomas with the county, and Danielle with Yakima Nation. The last thing I think that's important to recognize is that 10 acre feet of mitigation water sounds like a lot. That represents, you know, back in the napkin calculation, that could be 100 houses. So we want to be clear, we set aside 10 acre feet as mitigation water to ensure that we can then pull that back as this scoping process occurs. But this way that we are extremely confident that the water that we're asking for funding for acquisition for in-stream flow, none of that water would possibly or in any way ever be needed for mitigation. So we set more water into the mitigation side than will end up being needed, with the idea that we'll amend our purchase and sale agreement once we negotiate down that 10 acre feet with the family. And at this time, I'm happy to sort of answer more questions or more discussion here. I know this is definitely a more sort of challenging or involved transaction.
Thank you, Ethan.
I can't see faces and hands of everyone here right now, so just go ahead and pop in.
Okay, well, so far Sean has a question and then I'll have a question after that.
Hi, Ethan, this is Sean Gross, no officials. I'm just trying to clarify, you said you had one purchase and sale agreement and the rest of this is programmatic. I assume that means by programmatic, you mean this would be a chunk of money and then you would try and go acquire from these various parcels. Is number one, is that right? And number two, is the purchase and sale agreement with the Cromarties or is it with one of the other parties?
So the purchase and sale agreement is with the Cromartie family for the 4 water rights shown here. And we're at this time would just be seeking funding for this acquisition. We don't at this time have a letter of intent from any of the other opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I'd suggest you might think about splitting this up then, so that this whole mitigation water bank issue with Cromarties is, so we're not looking at thinking about those other parcels, because I think those are just straight acquisitions. Is this Cromartie thing, you know, this is going to bring up a number of concerns, questions, complications that other group may not. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we should see how these questions go, but you might want to think about severing them.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Ethan, I feel like this proposal asks us to weigh whether increased in-stream flow is valuable enough that we are willing to sacrifice protection of riparian habitat. And I'm just wondering if you can give us some insight into how that conversation has gone at Washington Water Trust or with other partners. And I guess for folks who maybe aren't thinking along those same lines, what I'm understanding is that this would, on the Cromartie parcels, this would then give future development access to domestic water. So there would then be the potential for building more houses in these parcels that are along the river.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, it's something that the Water Trust is taking very seriously. We share, the concern that we definitely do not want to allow development that would run counter to the environmental benefit. The discussions we've had is talking with Arden and talking initially with Danielle and with Fish and Wildlife is to think about what would be the necessary conditions on any mitigation certificates such that the trade-off is clear and strong for the environmental benefit. Some of those type conditions, like I mentioned, could look at no development both in the floodplain and the floodway. There are a number of non-conforming lots existing in Section 31. Our initial discussions with Arden have said that the county has no interest in seeing those become more non-conforming. Cromartie family, I think we may be looking at like section line adjustments such that they can get development out of those areas. But those sort of conditions are what we want to sort of talk and hear from everyone on this call and those other people we're talking scoping with to really understand what conditions and what amount would be allowable such that the environmental benefit is clear and that we're not going to allow any development that's damaging.
And I just had a follow-up question, Ethan. What was total acquisition pursued or a transfer of development rights on these parcels?
So to get the family at the table, it's been a 20-year process working with the family. They are not the easiest family to work with. They have their financial interests at stake, and are so when sort of the trade-off is that we can't get them to the table with a total acquisition. They're as sort of condition of their involvement in this project is that they would be able to have some very limited and constrained mitigation. And this is the same approach that the Water Trust has used with the Masterson Ranch, and sort of then with that Tidwell addition that extended the bank under there. And somewhat similar when the Bourne water bank was created and the Washington Water Trust, we purchased the water not used for mitigation under those water rights. This has sort of been the model and approach for these large senior water right holders to bring them to the table.
Follow-up from Alex is, in the absence of this purchase, could all of this water be sold to development uses?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. So at this time, the water rights are no longer in trust. The family could return to irrigation, barring if the purchase and sale agreement fell through. or they could look to work outside of any agreement with the water trust to develop their an agreement for mitigation. This sort of allows us to have a seat at that table and at least facilitate some of the discussions around what type of mitigation could be used.
Danielle had a question.
Yeah, Ethan, thank you for the presentation. You know, this is something that we are talking about in a different venue. And so, you know, at this point, evaluating this presentation, it's very hard to provide sideboards for what would be, you know, get it to something that I think people would be in agreement, because there's so many uncertainties and unknowns. Just want to say that, you know, looking at the number of plots that you have, if it were to follow the traditional mitigation certificate route, that would be approximately about 2.3 acre feet of water as opposed to the 10. And I think we did talk about that really early on, is that 10 is likely a very high number. I think that we had talked also before about, you know, needing to really understand the interruptibility of the 1902 water right. And just in both venues which we are talking in, I think that that's a really critical component. And if it was in the first few slides, I'm sorry if I missed it, but I think that that's critical information for our group. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I really appreciate that, and looking forward to sort of continuing discussions, as you said, sort of both here and in the other forums that we're talking with you and others. It looks like Matt Powers, you'd ask sort of on the fish benefit and stream flow side. The North Fork Teanaway River is one of the premier restoration target areas right now, not only in the Teanaway, but in the entire Yakima Basin. And the Teanaway system at large, I mean, if we think back 20 years, right, that the Teanaway was running dry in the late season. So it's very important in terms of fish recovery in the Yakima Basin. The Teanaway plays sort of an outsized role in terms of fish spawning. Given its size as a watershed, it has a disproportionate amount of fish use. Temperature is increasingly an issue, which flow can help with as well. So on the fish side, I kind of talked more about that in the first presentation, but happy to answer more questions on that. And Sean, I see you had another comment.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. I just, I want to, in a way, echo what Danielle said here about the difficulty for this group to evaluate this proposal with all the questions and details that are out there. I do appreciate that you're asking us for our input on what, you know, rules to put around mitigation, but that's, you know, that's an extremely detailed sort of set of questions and back and forth. And we tried doing something like that a few years ago on a different project that wasn't even water related in it. We don't really have a very good process here for you to come in with that big of a question that's kind of open-ended and has lots of details to it that and probably couldn't get resolved before we're going to have to evaluate your project here. I guess I'm just saying that because I'm just putting that out front here because I can kind of see how the discussions are going to go when we have to evaluate this. We're going to end up with a big long list of question marks. And I know it will be hard for us to move forward with it. If there's some way to, I guess I don't know. I mean, you know, it's not uncommon that we come back and ask a project to defer, meaning come back to us when you have the details figured out. This is going to be really tricky for us to kind of weigh these sort of trade-offs. Again, if you have a solid project that's not associated with the Cromartie deal, that severed, that's a simpler kind of way for us to look at a project and give a more definitive, kind of answer. So thanks.
No, thanks, Sean. I appreciate it and hear that. So to be clear, yeah, at this time, we don't have landowner acknowledgement forms for any of those other projects. So they're not on the table for funding at this time. There are projects that we're continuing to work with those landowners and hope in the future years maybe. But right now, the Cromartie family water rights. I think the only other thing I would add is the sort of in-stream flow portion of this that we're seeking to fund with Surfboard or cost share with Surfboard. That as the acquisition of that for in-stream flow is sort of the two pieces moving here jointly next to each other. What happens with the mitigation water and what in the in-stream flow piece. But that, yes, the in-stream or the mitigation water is, I'm not sort of maybe asking that you guys give us all the answers on that, but I wanted to sort of be very transparent about what this total transaction involves, that those sort of scoping discussions are something we're taking seriously, engaging with the relevant partners on, and share the concerns.
Jeanette had a question just about the original 7 properties that were listed, in the pre-application and going through the application versus the Cromartie property. And Jeanette, if I'm not posing that question correctly, can you weigh in?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, some of that was just discussed via Sean talking about it because what I've got is telling me you're asking for, $742,000 in total, half and half for sort of a bank of funds to go towards these 7 properties. And what you're saying now is that there's a purchase and sale agreement on, in process with Cromartie's. And are you asking us to basically replace everything else with this one PSA? And are the dollars the same? I'm not sure I completely understand the picture as you've presented it now versus what I have on paper.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. So when we put the application in, we put in all those 7 projects with the goal of we would develop projects with as many of them as possible. So correct, at this time, we would be not looking for that total amount of money. We'd be looking to pull this back just to the Cromartie. We kind of presenting this in this programmatic approach of talking about that the value to the river and the value environmentally is acquiring the senior water rights. And we sort of have that portfolio of senior water rights that we're pursuing as we can bring landowners on board with that. But that this funding cycle, the only landowner that we brought further enough along is the Cromartie family.
Danielle
Okay.
also had a question.
Which one of these 7 is the Cromartie one, and what's now the dollar ask? That part is not clear to me, because you have in the paperwork, it just lists 7 properties, and yes, there's detailed description of each property, but I don't know which one is the Cromartie in the list of 1 through 7, and therefore what's the dollar amount you're asking for?
It's project number 1 at this time, as written up in there. And I can provide more clarity or follow up and amend the application so it's more clear moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That helps because just flipping through, I can't tell that number 1 is the Cromartie.
No, I
Prop-
appreciate that. We do sometimes keep the landowner names off just because surfboard applications are public, and so just to sort of respect sometimes the landowner's wishes.
No, that's just fine. I just needed to make sure I, could tell what you were talking about in looking at this list and understanding the numbers, et cetera. Aside from the mitigation question. So thank you.
The only other context I'd add is this is the largest senior water right in that portfolio, the highest up on the North Fork Teanaway. So it has been sort of, from the water trust perspective of acquiring in-stream flow, has been sort of one of the bigger projects with the most active involvement and negotiation with the family.
So Ethan, this is Kirk, community member. So on the screen right now, if I'm reading the legend correctly, everything in the orange is the Cromarties, even under the hatched.
That's correct. The hashed overlay shows the place of use for the water right.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, but all of the oranges is Cromartie, correct?
Yes, those are all the parcels that they own.
And that's the one project you're working on. That's project number 1, right?
Correct, is for the 4 water rights shown on this map.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I see Danielle had a question.
Yeah, I just want to chime in here because this is a pretty diverse board, and I'm not certain, our advisory group, and I'm not certain that all of the people here kind of understand the nuances. And so I'm going to ask a couple questions, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page. First, if this transaction did not occur, would these parcels be able to be developed in the foreseeable future?
Great question. I'll give my best understanding and response, but I will be clear, I am relatively new into the water rights and can definitely do some follow-up on that. So at this time, Section 31 is in the red zone for mitigation, so there is no mitigation available. The only way that development could occur is for the Cromartie family to work with an existing water bank to get an amended trust water right agreement under that existing water bank to allow for an expansion of mitigation certificates into Section 31. That process is regulatorily controlled by ecology in terms of the water bank and trust water rights agreement. It would be up to the family outside of this transaction as currently discussed if that's something that they would be interested in pursuing. The family has been told and understood for a long time that operating their own water bank is not really an option on the table, that there's no sort of public benefit and there's no precedent to a single family getting their own water bank.
Okay, and then the follow-up question, would the water that's proposed for mitigation provide in time and in place mitigation for the new development?
And Ethan, before you answer that, Danielle, I don't quite know that the technical meaning of what you said. Do you mind describing that?
So my question is, so water rights, specifically agricultural water rights, have a season of use. And in the Teanaway, the season of use typically runs from somewhere around April through, depending on the water right, as late as September 1st. Whereas new home uses are year-round. So any mitigation that is provided in the Teanaway does not provide in-time and in-place mitigation. And so what we're talking about here is basically an expanded season of use for the development that's proposed on these parcels. And the real fundamental question that I think a lot of individuals are going to be struggling with is the in-stream flow benefit during the season, which it will occur, enough to offset the impacts during the seasons when the impacts will accrue. So hopefully, and I'm sure within our technical advisory group, we can talk about that in more detail, but it's a very complex question, and I know not all of us have the answer to it. Ethan, is that an appropriate summary?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I think you captured that well. And I'm happy to sort of do any follow-up with anyone who, if you're not familiar with water rights, I know a lot of this terminology might not be the easiest to track on.
Alex has a couple of questions related to the budget and also looks like related to water mitigation banking.
Yeah, Alex, I've got the chat up so I can see. I don't have right now the acquisition in front of me in terms of what would the new budget look like just for this, but that is something I'm happy to follow up with and can amend the application to be more clear on. I see your other question. You said if the water was put into a bank, could it be used as mitigation rights for parcels in Section 31 not owned by the Cromartie family? And that's very much part of the scoping discussion and would depend on which existing water bank likely that the family worked with, whether it's with the Bourne Water Bank or with the county water bank. The Cromartie family is seeking a mitigation exchange, meaning that they would put put part of that 10 acre feet of mitigation into the bank and get at no cost mitigation certificates out of it. Likely either water bank they work with would be seeking public benefit above and beyond that, but that's very much not a decided piece. It is in the discussion now, only constrained to Section 31 if there was to be any mitigation allowed outside of the Cromartie parcels.
I have time for like probably one more question before we move on to the next site visit, if there are any.
Sorry, I need a little bit of clarification. I think it was Danielle maybe asked back at the beginning about or made a clarification about the 10 acre feet versus in actuality 2.3 acre feet, and that was not clear to me what that was leading to. I don't know if Ethan or Danielle, if it was you, can clarify that issue for me.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead, Danielle?
Yeah, I'll just, so I was sitting here with my calculator, and in Kittitas County, for a home and 500 square foot of lawn and garden, which is kind of what the mitigation certificates are, the consumptive use of water is 0.137 acre feet per unit. And it changes a little depending on the details, but that's the high end. And I know this because I did a lot of these transactions when I worked for ecology. So all I did was I took the number of parcels and I multiplied them by that number. And I came out with the 2.3 acre feet for mitigation water. Now, with that said, they could constrain it even further and reduce that amount. But what I think my point was that 10 acre feet is very high, and it's truly unlikely that that 10 acre feet would be used to mitigate homes.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. That's entirely consistent with sort of what we've been looking at. So again, we just set the 10 acre feet aside to ensure that we had sufficiently separated the mitigation water from the in-stream flow water. And the family is aware that a condition of that is that whatever water is not used, whatever portion of that 10 acre feet is not used for mitigation, none of that water is allowed for any use of irrigation or anything. It will all be folded through an amendment of the purchase and sale agreement and protect its in-stream flow.
So one other thing, Ethan, they could use it for mitigation outside of the Teanaway Basin or lower in the system, right?
That's all subject to the scoping discussion and which existing water bank they work with.
Thank you, Ethan. Well, with that, I think we should probably transition on to the next presentation on